coins from Brave if you do that on the 21 Wire link, which is on the show page right now. So check it out and tell us if you think it's the fastest browser you've ever used. Everybody who's downloaded it has said it lightning quick. It's faster than Vivaldi, actually, in terms of speed. So do check that out. That's one way you can kind of help support us. We want to partner with Brave because we like what they're doing. We like the values behind what they're doing. And so we want to support them, and they can support us a little bit through this program. And we hope that it will also make your internet surfing quicker and not have to worry about being spied on or having your data saved and then sold or repackaged and given away and analyzed and so forth, which is what Microsoft and Google and many of these companies do with their browser information and data. So that's just one thing you can do to help us, and also to support companies that are doing good work like Brave, and also DuckDuckGo for search as well. And there's a few other independent search engines that we'll be promoting maybe in the new year as well. But at the moment, DuckDuckGo, we're partnering with them with an internal search bar at the top of the page. So you can search through our 8,500 articles and videos on 21 Wire using the DuckDuckGo internal search bar. It's at the top of the website at 21stcenturywire.com. Now, our next guest is, I could say, best-selling author. I think it's safe to say best-selling author because he has sold a lot of books in the last couple of years. Esoteric Hollywood, as soon as it came on the scene, was immediately a cult hit. A lot of people picked this book up, and there's never been a book actually like it before. And our next guest actually has the sequel ready. It's up for Christmas right now, Esoteric Hollywood 2. There's a link to it on the show page that goes right to the shop at Jay's Analysis, and that brings us to Jay Dyer, who's on the line right now. Hello, Jay.
Well, hey, Patrick, thank you for having me back. It's always a pleasure to be on 21 Wire. And in fact, you, in several footnotes, made it back into Esoteric Hollywood, too. Oh,
brilliant. Thank you for, we're glad that there's something worth referencing at 21stcenturywire.com. We appreciate that. And Jay, so the book, how long did it take to put it together? You've got it. It's out. It's ready. Is it? How would you compare it to the first book, Esoteric Hollywood?
Well, the people who have already dug into it, they actually say it's a better written book. It's a little more mature book, and they think it's better. So I've heard multiple people say it's a better text. It has more information. It's actually longer. I covered more films in this one. So far it's been a pretty hot item. I've sold quite a few in the last 4 days that I've had it ready to ship out. So yeah, I think I'm excited for it. I think it really is, I think, a better book. I think the subject matter is a little more down to earth, I guess you could say. I kind of went into symbolism and esotericism and in large areas of the first book, and in this one it's a little more grounded. I talk a lot about the influence of the mobs in Hollywood, different mafias, the Wasp Mafia, the Jewish Mafia. I talk about Spies and the usage of the War on Terror in film, how Hollywood really helped prep for the War on Terror, which also was related to the Cold War. Then I talk about the way that mind control was presented in film, and I talk about some of the more recent releases and books that have dealt with the CIA's actual mind control programs. And I do talk about geoengineering. There's a pretty lengthy geoengineering section of the book, all of which I think, again, is documented. There's a little bit of the esoteric in this one as well. I went into some of the more Luciferian, you might say, movies like The Ninth Gate from Polanski, or movies like Metropolis from Fritz Lang. And then in the final section of the book, it's focused on NGOs, transhumanism, and the influence propaganda in Hollywood. So it's all over the place, again, like the first one, which I think people liked. But I think I cover about 30 or 35 movies in this one as opposed to 20 or 25 in the first one.
Wow. Okay, this is interesting. What do you think? What do you think is the most controversial section of the new book? What do you think would be regarded as, maybe the most controversial or the most esoteric in terms of, hey, this hasn't really been talked about very much, and the reason it hasn't been talked about is because it's a bit forbidden to sort of talk about it in mainstream circles?
Would probably still be geoengineering because, there was just a article, I think 2 days ago in Forbes that was saying that Harvard scientists, now they want to experiment with plans to, quote, block out the sun because of the climate change scam and all this nonsense, which we know that really this is about depriving people of vitamin D. I think even, if I recall, Cass Sunstein wrote about the possibility of geoengineering and weaponizing the weather for the purpose of depriving people of vitamin D from the sun. You can't make that up. But if I recall, he did say that. So I did a pretty lengthy, heavily footnoted series of about, let's say, 50 pages on geoengineering. And I went into, documents from Stanford University, from the Royal Society, actually, on geoengineering, how to do it, how it's done. So I don't think that when we get these news stories saying that they may start in 2019 geoengineering, I think they're already geoengineering. So that's probably the most out there category of the book. Maybe the transhumanism book, I don't know. But I think the rest of it, pretty much people kind of have a sense that that this is true. I think there was a recent declassification of MK Ultra documents, which anybody who knows anything knows that was a real program or series of programs. So I don't think that's too controversial unless you're just a complete normie who has no conception of what's going on in the world.
Well, this is another thing that I see more prevalent, or is this might be, Jay, the dying last death pangs of a normie culture, but they're really they're wanting to attack people for wrongthink, basically. So if you're not with the consensus, if you're not with the mainstream consensus, I see more and more of this. Actually, is quite interesting that you somehow there's something wrong with you, or you should be considered an outcast from society. Because you believe this, or because you've written this, or spoken about this, or tweeted about that 5 years ago.
Well, yeah, I think, so we're going to be held hostage by comments that we made in the past. And I think you and I and Hesher and people in Boiler Room, we kind of anticipated that. We talked about how they would roll that out to, basically hold people hostage for an untoward taboo comment from 5 years ago. But the irony is that I remember a year ago, there were, I don't remember which mainstream publication it was, but there was two different stories in the same mainstream outlet, or maybe two different outlets, I don't recall. But one story was that you're crazy if you believe in geoengineering, and another story was, probably the Daily Mail, something to the effect of geoengineering and weather control is real, and the Russians are doing it against the West. So it doesn't exist. It's not real, but it does exist, and it is real, and it's the Russians that are doing it against the West.
Right. Yeah. But meanwhile, you can go into a number of public available documents, a number of academic studies and reports on geoengineering in practice and in theory, not just theoretical, but also actual real programs tied to the U.S. military.
Exactly. So, and going back to Vietnam and Agent Orange and all that, which is now documented that was actually experimentations, not just in biological warfare, but actually in atmospheric manipulation as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know if you covered this in your book or not, Jay, but that film Snowpiercer, I don't know if you... I
did. It is in there, yeah.
Oh, so that was a geoengineering-based narrative, wasn't it?
It was correct, yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So, but things went all wrong because they tried to reflect the sunlight out.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, the ones that I chose, there weren't a whole lot of options, and I didn't really think that the recent Jerry Bruckheimer movie, it was the Michael Bay, I think, did a very subpar movie called Geostorm, which is about geoengineering. So I think I mentioned it in passing, but I didn't put it in there because Michael Bay movies are basically just explosions. But I did put Dune in there because actually a big portion of David Lynch's Dune narrative is about terraforming and geoengineering. So Snowpiercer is also in there. The Alien franchise early on when it was Ridley Scott and then James Cameron also included multiple references to geoengineering, the climate, terraforming, and stuff like this. So in that regard, there's not a whole lot of film presentations that include the idea, but it is there. It is in some select films, and I wanted to talk about the reality of that. It's even in a very sort of absurd satire version of the Avengers. I'm speaking here of the British the spy show. I'm not talking about the Marvel Avengers, but the 1998 Avengers that had, I think it was Ray Fine, and it had Uma Thurman, and Sean Connery actually was all about geoengineering. That was the entire plot. And so a lot of, sometimes, it's the weird films that we don't expect that, that have these kind of Pentagon, CIA out there narratives that are somewhat true.
Yeah, no, it is actually woven into to quite a few films actually over the years.
Right.
So it seems to be one of those, and it's a funny marriage. It's usually paired up a lot with the kind of the Armageddon. Americans love the Armageddon narrative, or the end of the world narrative, and geoengineering is often paired up with that, or it's the flip side of that. That's the solution to Armageddon, basically. If it's not coming from outside in an asteroid form or an alien, it's something that needs to be done in the Earth's environment, change it, save the world, and so forth. As crazy as this sounds, Jay, that actually this is becoming mainstream thought. Mm-hmm. Fact. So, well, you mentioned Cass Sunstein, so.
Right. Yeah, and again, this book's a little different. I think the first, talk about different mobs for the first 70 pages, and then how Hollywood has participated in the idea of managed dialectics, that America is there to save us from all of the global threats, right? That America was propelled into a global police force situation largely through a lot of propaganda. In other words, that was what was helpful in convincing people of this narrative. And I also went into the Hollywood 10, if you remember the narrative that, there's Marxists everywhere in Hollywood, and we've got to, have this, all the McCarthy type stuff. We got to root out all the Russian operatives and the Marxists everywhere. Mm-hmm. So I actually go into that pretty in depth, and I talk about how I think this was really scare tactics. There were some Marxists, but as even Dr. Quigley himself, the great apologist for the Atlanticist establishment, says, there really wasn't any threat from actual Marxists. The main threat to or power moving America was actually the billionaire corporate financial oligarchs. So they were the real threat. That was who was really controlling America. It wasn't threats from card carrying members of the Communist Party.
Yeah, well, it's funny that you mentioned this, Jay. Do you see this same exact pattern being playing out right now today?
Absolutely.
With the Russian threat, basically.
Yeah.
So Russia's meant to be the enemy in the shadows, behind everything, behind every crisis, every argument, even people disagreeing on social media. That's blamed on the Russians, basically.
The Russian bots are everywhere.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Anything that goes on online that doesn't go the way of the establishment, it's the fault of the Russians. They're omnipresent, right? So they've almost now replaced the Russians. That's like the new ISIS. I remember 4 years ago, ISIS was everywhere, doing everything, behind everything. Now we're back to what is it? It's 1950 or whatever, and we're in the midst of the Cold War again. And you watch these Bond novels, and it's like, or these Bond films, and I do go into some more of the Bond stuff in this book because of the section about the Cold War. You feel like it's decades ago. You're back in some situation when you're being told that Russians are going to steal some secret technology, and they're going to manipulate the election, with Google's secret ad tech that they spent $4,600 on. That's going to somehow mystically, magically, turn the entire election for Trump. And even though, the Google employees put like $1.6 million into Hillary's campaign, it was the secret. If you watch Bond films, there's always some secret some little decoder or some sort of secret file. I guess the Russians had a secret file machine, encoder, cryptogram, a magic machine that somehow took that $4,600 and sort of swung the entire election for Trump. So we're back in the 1950s again, I guess.
Yeah. To believe that narrative. So there's a lot of, Jay, just quick. I'm not not going off on a bird walk here, but there's a lot of smart people, Jay, that believe that. They actually believe that that $4,700 was somehow amplified and leveraged because of the genius of Putin, probably, and somehow that made its way to swing the election. There's people with PhDs, Jay. There's leading personalities, analysts on TV. There's journalists. There's academics. They actually. I'm not saying that I am saying they buy it, Jay. I'm saying they believe it. And so how did that come to be, Jay, that smart people could believe something so unbelievable?
Well, it goes back to, I think I mentioned it in this book, the great moon hoax of the 1890s. It was one of the first print stories in I think, Chicago or somewhere. I don't remember the publication, but it's a famous story, and they talked about bat people on the moon, and the intelligentsia believed it because it was in a reputable, sourced, mainstream publication, and it was actually, again, it was more of your run-of-the-mill farmer types, that were skeptical of this bat people on the moon. That's not true. It's a famous hoax story. It was a hoax series of articles that scientists had discovered. That the experts had discovered there were in fact bat people civilizations on the moon, and then of course it was later discovered to be a hoax. And who believed it? Well, it was all the academics and the intelligentsia, the PhDs of the time believed this, right? So no different. That's the power of propaganda. It's we don't even the people with PhDs don't realize that these goofy movies that they watched, like you're watching, I don't know, Jack Ryan or some Tom Clancy thing, and in the Tom Clancy, the most recent Jack Ryan from a couple of years ago, you had basically all the Russian Orthodox churches in America. They were all secret Russian terrorist organization networks, and the plot was, they're gonna sink the stock market through some sort of secret tech or hacking or something. So quite literally, before all the Russian narrative, the last Jack Ryan movie, not the most recent one, I guess it was like 2 or 3 years ago, the Jack Ryan narrative literally had Russian operatives coming through the Russian Orthodox Church in America, basically tanking the American economy. So, maybe prepping us for Russiagate, perhaps.
Yeah, maybe, perhaps. And that's a nice segue to the next part of our discussion I want to ask you about. But before we depart, Esoteric Hollywood 2, you can get that on the live link right now on our show page. That goes straight to Jay's analysis, the shop on Jay's analysis. You can get a copy there. Are you doing signed copies as well, Jay?
Yeah, that's the advantage of if you get it from my website. I do sign copies, and Amazon kind of undercuts the author, so I don't really do very good if you get it on Amazon. Right.
Okay, so hopefully people will go to your website to pick up the book, and what's the turnaround time on the delivery, Jay? Roughly,
for most places in the U.S., it's within a week. Sometimes a little more, depending on when they order. But outside the U.S., it's usually within 2 to 3 weeks.
Okay, that's not bad. So if you get it, you can get it now, before the New Year. In some cases in the U.S., and a little bit after the New Year if you're in Europe or further afield. So check it out. Esoteric Hollywood 2, better than the first edition as well, according to the reviews and people who've looked at the book already. So that's something to get your hands on if you want to get more au fait with the things that we're talking about here today. Now, in terms of the Russian Orthodox Church, Jay, this is a huge story that a lot of people haven't really caught on to because there's other things. But in Europe, it has got a lot of traction comparably to the States. And just to give people just a brief overview of what's happening in the Ukraine, because I think this is historic, and put it into context, there is indication that there is some CIA involvement in this drive to split the Russian Orthodox Church, to have a Ukrainian independent Orthodox Church, to break away. This is basically to undermine the whole institution of the Russian Orthodox Church. Just explain to us what's going on.
Exactly, and I would add as well, beyond Ukraine, it has ramifications elsewhere because it affects Orthodoxy in the rest of the world. So it's also intended to I would argue, divide Orthodox Christianity in America as well, which is not huge, but does have a bit of a presence. It exists in all the states. Basically, you could view, my analysis would be, you could view the present attempt to create an autonomous Ukrainian Orthodox so-called church, which is being spearheaded by the Patriarch of Constantinople, as well as his handlers. You could view that as a successor to what happened in 2014. So basically, we know about Victoria Nuland and the money that was poured into the Q in the Ukraine back to the 90s. And when that was achieved in 2014, we know this was an attempt to essentially remove that area from the sphere of influence of Russia. And so at the same time, we have 4 years later, 5 years later, the attempt to do the same thing in the religious sphere, because, of course, Orthodoxy is the most prevalent religion in the region. There's also some Catholics as well, but not as many, obviously. So this is a double-headed, double-pronged attempt to reduce the influence of Russia. So the way it was done was very similar to the way it was the Maidan situation happened, except this was more of a subtle religious coup. This is why John McCain and his many trips over to various regions to see various nefarious characters, well, he just happened to also stop in and visit the Ukrainian nationalist so-called patriarch, right? But this was, I think, 2 or 3 years ago. And he was given awards, and then magically, mystically, meetings were had with Joe Biden as well, between Patriarch Bartholomew, who, again, is in Constantinople. Now, a lot of people have for many years noted the fact that Bartholomew, who's in Constantinople, who's not a pope, by the way, he's just one of many bishops in Orthodoxy. It's a more decentralized church than the Roman Catholic Church. Okay. Well, many people have noticed that he is quite clearly under the sphere of NATO and the influence of the CIA. So this is no mystery. This has been talked about for a long time. And this is, of course, why we see him touting the green agenda. We see him buddying up to Pope Francis, all this kind of stuff. And that's because he's under that sphere of influence. There's no question about it. So whatever happened to make him basically push for this Ukrainian autocephalous or independent Orthodox so-called church there was really a geopolitical move. It really had nothing to do with theology or religion. It's completely geopolitical. And very recently, I guess within the last 2 months, it led to the severing of communion. So there's essentially a rejection by the Patriarch of Moscow of Bartholomew for this action, because it is seen to be uncanonical. This has always been a region under the aegis of Russia. So it's really transparent. And I, of course, had been talking about that. It wasn't that hard to figure out. It wasn't any harder to figure out than the Ukraine coup in 2014 was hard to figure out. Right? It was very, very transparent. And then, in the last few days, we had the puppet CIA patriarch there awarding the former head of the CIA for helping him. So, you can't get any clearer than that. And quite specifically, awarding him for helping him get his independent, supposedly independent, although guess what? They just happen to be quite linked to the Poroshenko government. So are they really independent? No, of course not. They are under the aegis of Western influence. So that's the long and short of it. And ultimately it has to do with, attacking Russia in the religious sphere this time, and the influence of the Russian Orthodox Church. And then in America, it has the effect of splitting basically the Greek Orthodox in America, who are tending to side with Bartholomew because of his status as Patriarch of Constantinople, and is causing a rift in America as well. And that was, of course, done by design. So divide and conquer, really simple here. Not a whole lot of the theology. You don't even have to know all the theology. It's just another version of divide and conquer is what it amounts to.
So aside from the geopolitical aims of that sort of operation to sort of reduce Russian influence, specifically in the Ukraine, but also in the whole region, even globally, via church. But is there also a deeper agenda possibly at play? For instance, look at the Reformation or the revisions made in the Vatican II, for instance, that elevated Israel to sort of a higher position within some of the usual sort of statements that are made at each mass and generally with the Vatican. Is there also is it with this move here that you're talking about, the division of the Russian Orthodox Church, would they try to inject a different social agenda through this new Ukrainian Orthodox Church, for instance? And I'm talking about a progressive agenda, a social agenda.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. There's no question. I mean, we've already seen in the Ukraine the introduction of a lot of the degenerate morals that the West is known for that were not previously publicly displayed in Ukraine. Now on public display. They get all the same parades, all the same transvestite, trans stuff now to be celebrated. Now, the created Ukrainian church here, the new one, the puppet church here, this one, they may not openly be saying, let's have, this complete degeneracy. But the point, but in fact, that's what you get with IMF, with the West, with all of the NGOs, the think tank. Once you allow that to flood in, that's what comes. So it whether the puppet patriarch here is openly advocating for the degeneracy or not really doesn't matter, because it's coming along with the 2014 coup and with that government and the open markets, the free markets. Well, that requires open sexual degeneracy as well. That's just part of the market. Everything is part of the market. So whether they are doing that openly or not doesn't really matter. However, they are, in fact, this is the irony of this, is that it was, in fact, Roman Catholics and Jesuits who helped to get this religious coup to help to get it through. Right. So there were actually Jesuits in the Ukraine who, of course, are under the aegis of Rome, which Rome is under the aegis of the West and the CIA, which Wim Hof has documented in his book, unquestionably. So the ecumenical movement was actually a covert tool here, as you were speaking of with Vatican II. In the same way, yes. So they're trying to sort of coerce. And I think eventually the rumors are that the goal will be to try to bring Bartholomew and the Greeks back under the Pope. Surprisingly, that's the 10-year, 15-year plan.
So would this extend in terms of the social agenda? Would it be fair to say that on the whole, the Russian Orthodox Church or Orthodoxy in general is more conservative than the Catholic Church? And I would say, how would this affect issues like divorce and abortion? Would those be central battlegrounds in this operation, this split?
Yes and no. I mean, Orthodoxy has a different 2,000-year tradition of divorce than the view of the Roman Catholic Church. So divorce itself is a bit of a debatable topic because Orthodoxy does allow divorce. However, abortion, on paper at least, I don't think any of the churches would openly affirm abortion. Neither Catholic nor Orthodox. Nobody would openly affirm it. Pretty much only very liberal strands or Protestants who are very liberal would openly affirm abortion. But there's definitely there is definitely a moral aspect to this. It kind of just depends on which area we're talking about. So in certain areas like the roles of the church and the state, or the roles of men and women, masculinity, this kind of stuff, femininity, the Russian church would certainly be more traditional in those ideas, especially since the course of the Roman Catholic Church since Vatican II, which has gone, more and more and more towards these ideas of progressivism, and we see this with Francis pretty clearly, who's a pretty radical sort of progressive figure in terms of Roman Catholic theology.
Yeah, so I'm also wondering as well. Well, the last question would be on this is that I've seen the comment made that especially in Russia there been a resurgence of the church after the collapse of the Soviet Union. When the Iron Curtain fell, there's been kind of a resurgence in engagement and membership, and basically in the church's role in public life. In other words, the church has become a powerful mediator between the state and the people, basically.
Right.
And the closer that the government, let's say in Moscow, is more engaged with the church, the better relations it will also have with the public in general, and that
Right.
creates a kind of a balancing situation in terms of society, and that it would be preferable for the United States to try to destroy that
Yes.
that buffer. How do you view
Absolutely.
that? Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. There's no question that the idea of what's called symphonia, which is a Greek term for the harmony of church and state working together. So anytime you see a double-headed eagle, that's not a Masonic symbol, by the way. Originally, in the Byzantine Empire, it just signified two heads of the eagle, right? One body, two heads, basically church and state working in harmony, which is the ideal. Never perfect. There's always going to be corruption. But that's at least the ideal, because it just, even from a practical perspective, even if a person doesn't believe in these things, just from a practical perspective, society seems to function a lot better, rather than when we introduce all this sort of inverted, subverted, toxic stuff. And the history of what we have in America is very different. So again, whatever one thinks of religious liberty and all those things, which again, even Russia still has religious liberty, they do forbid certain sects like Scientology and Jehovah's Witnesses, because those have, of course, been connected to being intelligence fronts. So it can get hairy at times, but the point is that yes, there's no question that the even though a person might think that religious liberty is always just an ideal, or that separation of church and state is always an ideal, there can actually be situations where that's weaponized, and it may not always be ideal. So, in fact, the U.S. government absolutely, from a psychological warfare perspective, would 100%, if they wanted to weaken a society, what they would do is, and again, it's not because they care about truth, freedom, and the American way or whatever, Superman's justice in America, whatever. It's because it's a means of psychological warfare and weakening that society. So they would absolutely want to cause any kind of friction or split between the relationship of the church and the state that they could.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, and the other thing is, the obvious thing, Jay, is that the church tends to foster and support the family as the central organizing principle of society, right. whereas the international corporation would like to destroy the family and atomize society and get women into the workplace to become wage slaves, basically. And so in that sense, the church is kind of an obstacle to the corporatist culture, maybe.
Absolutely. Oh, fundamentally, there's no question. This is why there's really no way to be an atomistic libertarian, laissez-faire neoliberal proponent if you're also attempting to be Orthodox or to be some form of traditional Catholic or whatever. Any of those positions really, it's mutually exclusive with saying that at the same time, but I believe in completely open markets. The market should dominate everything. Everything should be commodified. No. Those are incompatible worldviews, and this is essentially why, I made videos, say, critiquing Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson has a lot of good things to say, has a lot of insights. I don't dislike everything he says, but on this very point, I think he can be critiqued. That the sort of classical liberal laissez-faire approach that he's got really is what got us into a lot of the problems that we're in today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not advocating by any means that for women not to be in the workforce. What I'm saying is that there are people, organizations, politicians, political figures that are actively basically saying that the family is redundant. The family needs to go. We don't need families, and so forth. And the state can be the parent, the state can be the matriarch or the patriarch or whichever. So I think that by getting rid of the church or by undermining the church in Eastern Europe or in that sphere, that could be a way to kind of help to fragment and fracture society, to split continuity and make it more divide and conquer, basically.
Yeah, I think that we have to just understand there's a level of complexity here. So, for example, sometimes nationalism can be a positive force, but sometimes it can be a tool. So there's not always a catch-all silver bullet solution to, oh, well, I'm just a nationalist. In every case, nationalism is the solution. It just depends. I mean, nationalism historically was a revolutionary force. So, again, the context is what matters. So in the Ukraine, nationalism has been pushed by the West all the way back to, for a long time, back to World War I. Hitler relied on the idea of Ukraine as an independent state to remove it from the sphere of Russian influence. So it was back in the 40s. Hitler was trying to do the exact same thing that the U.S. State Department was trying to do since the 90s. So that's an example of nationalism being a tool and bad news. In some cases, nationalism is positive, right? For people wanting to protect their people group against, it could function at times as a firewall against globalism and free trade and all this kind of stuff. But in other cases, it can be a tool. So there's no easy answers to all these kinds of questions. But I think you're fundamentally absolutely correct that just like nationalism can be a bad thing, so also can completely free markets and completely commodified everything can become a tool. Having everybody in the workforce can become a tool of social engineering and weaponization. And yes, it's destructive to society. And it's just the key here is that it's destructive on purpose. That's what people don't realize, is that there are powerful forces who will utilize these things because they intentionally know they're destructive. It's not because they care about freedom and liberty and democracy and human rights and all this gobbledygook they talk about.
Yeah, but they mask it to make it seem like this is what you want, to make it look like it's a desirable lifestyle. It's a desirable society, a utopia of sorts, a corporatist.
Well, let's take another example. A great example with drugs. I just read this a couple days ago. I was reading about Tim Leary and Walter Bowert's book on MK Ultra, and there was a great quote, not great in the sense of being good, but an illustrative quote from Timothy Leary where he says something to the effect of, he says, look, it was hard for me to try to convince people to take LSD because it was such an extreme drug. He said, so what I knew I could do to foster the drug war, quote unquote drug war, to popularize drug culture, he says, which, by the way, was a psyop on the masses. He says, what I did was I just couched it as a right. You have a right to blow your mind out on acid. And the man is keeping you down. He said that made it go crazy, like everybody wanted it then. Yeah. That's very, very effective psychology. So they made it something they desired. They wanted to you be free, liberate yourself. Yes, well, since the 60s, that's been the whole NGO model, has been the human rights model.
Yeah. You have a right to trip off your head and see fractals for 2 days. Yeah, that's your right. Well,
and I'm not trying to be a prude or say that drugs are in every case always wrong. I'm just kind of making the point. I think you would agree that the drug culture was kind of used as as a means of warfare on the public. Yeah. No, I think the evidence bears that out, Jay. For anybody that's looked and bothered to read it, and it's also, this has been compiled in book form. There's a number of authors who've detailed and chronicled this, as well as yourself, on this very topic. So, Dave McGowan's book is probably one of the seminal collections on this. I think. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's others too. Yeah, John Potash just recently published a book, Drugs as a Weapon Against Us. We look back to Iran-Contra and the trafficking of cocaine. That was intentionally sent to black areas. I think that pills and meth, have been intentionally sent to Middle America and the South U.S. on purpose. I would argue that's the case.
Yeah. Well, in fact, we posted a couple of good stories up on 21 Wire this week. One of them was about Gary Webb in his Dark Alliance series, crack cocaine, the Contras, and the CIA, connecting the dots. and the other one was about the heroin epidemic during the Vietnam War, Air America, and sort of just the availability of cheap heroin on the streets of North America and Europe, and what that did to society at the time.
Yes.
What it's doing now, it's that the heroin was almost gone. It was almost wiped off the face of the earth in the 1990s because the supply had constricted to such a degree that the price was too high, and therefore it just didn't appeal to a wider range of junkie. But then after the Afghan War, the United States getting involved in Afghanistan, now you have a huge, cheap supply of heroin, a totally globalized, commercialized market, and more people are smackheads as a result. And it's had devastating effect, especially in the United States, on the poorer, more vulnerable, I would say, sections of society. So
absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely. And one of the great global drug lords just passed away, who was involved in that very thing, the BCCI, Bank for Credit and Commerce International, which was the CIA front bank behind the Iran-Contra. And then using that large amounts of liquid cash to then fund the Mujahideen and black operations. So yeah, that's also another added bonus of the massive drug profits is the secret cash that's then black budget stuff that's then used to fund the black operations.
And admittedly as well, one Lebanese drug kingpin who became a drug kingpin during the Syrian War the last 8 years, and by selling Captagon, which is a really potent amphetamine pill, it was using that cash to basically fund the so-called rebel groups, militias in Syria, and this was run out of Lebanon, basically.
Wow.
Saudi Arabia is also involved in the Captagon trade, so you can kind of see if anybody does any serious work, I hope one day, on sort of connecting the dots of that network during the Syrian War, you'll find again, Jay, like the other wars, the narcotics has played a role. Some role could be a couple of $1 billion a year, but by funding some of these militia groups, as was the case with the Mujahideen as well. So
yes. Yeah. Am I right, too, in thinking there was something, Khashoggi, which I think was the uncle of the guy who was killed, we're told, at least, supposedly killed?
Yes.
Wasn't he? I know he had a giant yacht that I think he sold to Trump. Didn't he have some sort of role in something like this, maybe?
Well, there was a prince who did get caught at Beirut airport with I don't know how many $millions worth of Captagon pills. It was a big bust a couple of years ago. I think it was a prince, although that's a bit of a flexible one because there's thousands of these princes in Saudi, so I'm not sure which strand of the royal family he was from. But point is, and he was conveniently, I think, let go. I don't think he did any hard time. Obviously.
I may be thinking of arms. I think maybe Adnan Khashoggi.
Oh yes,
has to do with arms trafficking.
Yeah, arms trafficking for sure. Yeah, that's the same family. Absolutely. Adnan Khashoggi, infamous arms trader, feted in high society through the 70s and 80s. Really well connected guy, friends of celebrities, friends of Henry Kissinger, or whoever. I don't know, friends of everybody basically. BCCI, yes, 100%. Probably a CIA asset, I would imagine.
Right.
That kind of goes without saying there. But yeah, thank you, Jay. Thank you very much for that. And again, Esoteric Hollywood 2, Jay, on sale now. There's a link on the show page. So,
could I mention maybe briefly some of the films?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I know that's always a question everybody asks is like, well, what movies are in this one? And like the cover doesn't really tell you. So just real quick, I'll list a few of the films here. So in the first section, I cover Aviator, Godfather, Point Break, which was actually a kind of an FBI propaganda film. A lot of people kind of overlook the FBI's role in Hollywood, we think, and other Army and Navy roles. But there's also FBI role, which is very, very big. V for Vendetta, The Prisoner series with Patrick McGowan, Roman Polanski's Ninth Gate, more Twin Peaks, Back to the Future, Goonies, Ghostbusters, Poltergeist, Time Bandits. And then I discuss a pretty lengthy chapter on LSD. I go into some more Kubrick with Clockwork Orange, John Carpenter's They Live, Lost Boys, Neon Demon, The Cell, Dune, Snowpiercer, Alien, and then in the final section, it's NGOs, feminism, transhumanism, and I discussed Tron, the Matrix trilogy, Running Man, Terminator, Her, Ex Machina, Westworld, Cherry 2000, and Metropolis.
Yeah, I heard a lot of transhumanist titles there as well. Just quickly, what did Time Bandits, before we got a minute left, what did Time Bandit, how did that come up on your radar, Time Bandits?
A lot of Terry Gilliam films have fairly Gnostic themes. So there's kind of a Jungian, Carl Jung Gnostic archetype theme going on there, and the idea of kind of an absurdist universe, that good and evil are really absurd ideas. So a pretty, I would argue, Freemasonic philosophy to Time Bandits. Sean Connery usually is in that kind of a movie. If we think back to Man Who Would Be King, which is an overtly Masonic film. So, that's kind of the angle I took on Time Bandits.
Wow, interesting. I didn't know that about Sean Connery, actually. So that's another one.
Yeah, you should watch the Man Who Would Be King, because it's about the British Empire utilizing the Lodge, actually. Interesting.
So there's something there for people to go.
Rudyard Kipling, right.
Well, that's Jay Dyer, author of Esoteric Hollywood 2. You can catch that online, and do order. If you don't have the first book, probably a good idea to buy both of these books, Esoteric Hollywood 1 and 2, and then you'll have a really good overview and a really good background on this, and so it's one of the best resources on this subject that you can possibly get, and the author Jay Dyer has put a lot into this. Pretty much, I'd say that's at least a decade of his work that you're finding there. So
pretty much, yeah.
There's a lot of depth there. There's a lot behind it, and we encourage you to go and get that. It's also a great gift for people who love films. Certainly everybody knows somebody who loves movies, so this would be a great gift for them too, for Christmas.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So take care, Jay. There he goes, ladies and gentlemen. Jay Dyer, author of Esoteric Hollywood 2. You can catch that at Jay's Analysis. And also you can catch Jay on ACR's Boiler Room, which airs every week on the Alternate Current Radio Network on Thursday nights. And also Jay's Analysis podcast as well, which is also on ACR, the Alternate Current Radio Network. And Jay's got a pretty substantial archive of lectures and talks and a lot of things. So it's one of the best resources you can get, not just Hollywood, also geopolitics, philosophy, religion, cults, and many, many other things. We're going to take a short break, and we're going to come back, and we're going to talk about, a lot of people know about William Blum. He passed away this week. We're going to talk briefly about William, and we're going to air a conversation that I had with the best-selling author, William Blum, in January 2017. Great conversation. We're going to play that for you. On the other side, I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. This is the Sunday Wire. I'm here with Mike Robinson, editor of the UK.